staff from the University of Chester. My name is Emily Withrow. I'm a psychology student here, as well as a member of the Economic Society. I want to express my our greatest gratitude for your guys' presence here. Your engagement and contributions are invaluable. But before we start, I want to let everyone know that to access the bathrooms, they're going to be on the ground floor. So just take the stairs down and then it'll be to your left. In the case of a fire, we will all meet outside at the parking lot outside of this building. And just to let everyone know, this event will also be recorded. All right, and then moving on to the agenda for today. We will start with an introduction to the event, as well as each of the panelists will introduce themselves. Then we will be discussing capitalism's start, so the history of capitalism, where it came from. Then we will move on to capitalism's strengths and weaknesses, and we will end the discussion with future actions and implications. After that, the audience Q&A will start, and you can either voice your questions to the panelists in person, or we will have a QR code that you can then scan to type in your questions. After the event has ended, we will conclude the event with the opportunity to network, and for refreshments and snacks will be available to the side. So, why are we all here today? At the beginning of March, I came across an insightful article by Dr. Batash, who unfortunately can't make it today because of an unforeseen medical emergency. So we will just have 3 discussion panelists here today. However, his article explored the relationships between capitalism and psychology. After discussions with the Economic Society, we explored how different disciplines address these issues that capitalism perpetuates, creating an opportunity for conversation and collaboration between the multiple disciplines. Something that Dr. Patak also heavily emphasized within his article. As a result, the Economic Society and I decided to work together to organize a panel discussion. Inviting experts from various fields to talk about their different insights regarding capitalism. I would now like to welcome to the stage Sebastianasuribe, who studies economics and sociology, to the stage today. Thank you.
So, thank you, Emily, for this wonderful introduction. And I'm very glad to see all these different disciplines here today. And the reason is that no matter if you study computer science or health management or sociology, capitalism influences every single one of our lives. So this system, capitalism, that we live in, it affects our decisions day by day. And that doesn't matter if you're paying your tuition fees, buying clothes or food, or even for my international students, do your currency exchange. Capitalism shapes these rules. And have you ever considered whether you have had a voice in how the system has been shaped? And what is our role as global citizens now to shape the future of the system as well? So despite the positives and negatives of capitalism, it has become this large rolling ball, one we cannot stop and turn back, but perhaps one we can shape in a direction that we want to. And that is the goal of this discussion here today, to shed the light on how interdisciplinarity can shape the direction of this rolling ball of capitalism. It's a discussion beyond disciplines, beyond nationalities, one that will make us question the unquestioned and challenge the unchallenged. So we aim to spark meaningful reflection and a shared sense of possibility and responsibility for a more just, inclusive, and democratic future of a global economic system. So with that, I am very grateful to have these great minds unite today. I would like to welcome you all on the stage.
Remember the order?
I think here in the middle.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So I'll briefly introduce to you our panelists. And as mentioned, unfortunately, Professor Karim Batash couldn't make it here today due to medical reasons. So we have lecturer Jennifer Robinson, a lecturer in sociology, currently pursuing her PhD. We have Dr. Michael Francis, program leader and senior lecturer in global affairs, politics, and international relations. And Dr. Emike Nasamu, a behavioral insights advisor in public sector, who was previously also a lecturer in economics, senior lecturer here at the University of Chester. So Jen, if we may start with you, in a couple of sentences, what are your research interests? Why is the topic of capitalism important to you? And what's your favorite food?
I'll start with the obvious and easy one. My favorite food is Thai food. I spent a year living in Thailand, and one of my favorite things about the country was the food, and I miss it greatly. So I'll start with that. That's a few sentences just on the food.
That's all right.
Okay, so why am I here, I guess? My research in terms of my own PhD looks at gambling-related harm, which lots of people might automatically link with economy and finances and loss and gain. I take a slightly different angle looking at that. So I'm particularly interested in the role of capitalism from the point of view of the production, the distribution, and the restriction of resources, be it physical, economic, social, or cultural. So I'll share with you a snippet of my data, which I love and I try to keep at the forefront of my mind when I'm thinking about my work, is that I spoke to somebody who said to me, he was really keen on climbing. He loved climbing. His life had been pretty much destroyed by gambling, but he loved to climb. And he said to me, Jen, the thing is, it's like climbing is, there's like shelves in front of you. He said, it's like climbing is on this really high shelf up here. And he said, and it's like gambling is on this shelf here. And that it really stayed with me, this idea of the availability, of the ease, of our engagement, of our ways of being. So I suppose that although I recognize fully that we'll talk about capitalism in terms of economic systems, for me, I'm more interested in thinking about it as a force. I'm more interested in thinking about it from the perspective of ways of thinking and ways of being. I'm particularly interested in capitalism as an embodied experience. And I think I've well and truly gone over my few sentences.
That's very fine. And yeah, I think that was a great start. If we move on to you, Michael.
Oh, okay. What were the questions again? It was research interests and okay.
And the food.
And the food, of course. Okay. Well, I'm an anthropologist, and a lot of my work is done, field work is done out in the Kalahari, working with former hunter-gatherers. I say former hunter-gatherers because as they were enveloped within the capitalist world system, they were often kicked off their land. They became farm laborers. And so they're at the sharp edge of capitalism, if you will. And so you can see those contradictions of capitalism really, really clearly from that position. But then moving into international relations, as I do now with the new Global Affairs program, I do a lot of stuff on political economy and kind of the big picture. And so I link those remote peoples out in the edges and the fringes of the world to these central systems and into that longer history of colonialism, which is intricately linked to capitalism as well. And it's an all-encompassing system, and it constantly moves into every new environment, and it's fundamentally important to understand it as a process. But I think also as an anthropologist, what you can see is that alternatives exist. Sharing economies, gift economies, other ways of being, other ways of doing things that are not based on that. And my applied research, which is outside my kind of academic stuff, is a lot of working as a consultant, doing development work, working with communities, working with mining companies that have displaced communities and trying to get lives restarted. And the idea is always integrate them into the markets. And to do so, though, is to forever condemn them to a life of poverty. And so there's something quite perverse about that. again over time, I suppose. So move on. Favorite food. I won't steal a whole genre of food like Thai. I'll narrow it down specifically. Pizza, fantastic. Every kid will eat it. You can always like whip it up if you need to, just with some cheese and tomato sauce, and really simple. And it's like a go easy to.
Quite a contrast to the complexities of capitalism.
Yes, absolutely.
Emike, if we
Thank you very much. So I'll start very easy, like Jen, and say that my favorite food, I'll pick a whole genre. I really love Japanese food. You can basically kidnap me with this. Please don't try to do that. In terms of my research interest, or I would say kind of like my intellectual journey, because I can't really use the word academic now that I've sort of jumped ship. So I'm a behavioral economist, and I kind of got interested in doing a PhD because I was really keen in seeing how kind of like psychological processes of choice affects like the economic agent. So it's like when you're deciding to, I don't know, save or not save, what are you thinking about? What are the systems that are driving your decisions? And building on that, I went on to do some work in well-being economics. So thinking more about motivators, but not just monetary motivators, but large-scale motivators. What are the things that what are the things that are, relevant to our human lived experience, just besides money? And then on top of that, I started to think, well, with all these tools that, behavioral tools that we know, so we know that people are kind of locked into a status quo, or, people have an inertia when it comes to like making decisions. The way we know it in academia is the way they know it in markets and in businesses with firms. So my thinking became, yes, if firms can exploit these sort of very basic human thinking and processes, do we have a central planner that is protecting the people from firms taking advantage of them? And that sort of colored my, I don't know, desire to go into regulation. So at the moment, I work with the Competition and Markets Authority, and as the name as the name encompasses, we're the primary competition regulator of the UK, basically looking at different markets, and also looking at agents in the markets to think about how we can improve these systems for people day to day, essentially understanding the markets. I would say like capitalism is a system that we can't work outside of, because we're trying to improve like the lives of economic agents within the system that we exist in. So one could argue that capitalism is kind of like the plate on which I have to consider my day-to-day decisions and sort of day-to-day thinking about the incentives of like the firms and the economic agents and the consumers, even the government, within like this entire, if you want, open, sometimes closed system. I don't know if that has helped you.
No, definitely I think that's a great start. And we have mentioned the word capitalism, I think, quite a bit. And just before we delve into the history of it, since we're on your word, Emike, maybe you could explain this plate. What actually is it? What is capitalism that we need to function within?
So I think definitely Michael and Jen will have a deeper, more historical perspective on capitalism. So I won't go too much into the history of it, but I'll sort of pick on some elements that I think kind of color how we experience the day to day. If you think about capitalism from an economics perspective, the first sort of words that will jump to your mind is like private ownership of resources and profit-seeking behavior. So this plate, if you want, or defined by the incentives, like the incentives that drive capitalism, is the desire for, if you're a firm, profit. You want to maximize your profits. You want to increase your share. So you want to increase your ownership of resources, and you want to kind of ensure that you are at the top of the pecking order somehow. So you want to satisfy your shareholders. and you want to gain as much market share as possible. You want to attract a lot of consumers. At the end of the day, I would say like this profit seeking or this rent seekingness allows for a system where things that don't quite align with the incentive kind of falls through the cracks. So things that take more like, things that have a greater good consideration, or things that have a more public good consideration, these sort of things can tend to fall through the cracks when the primary motives are kind of profiteering or rent seeking.
Brilliant. And so what we're hearing is kind of that capitalism sparks this kind of profit for like personal profit, also personal gain. If Michael, if I can ask you, do you think that has always been the case, that people have sought the best for themselves, or like historically?
Well, no.
Or
I mean, you can go back, if you go to swing out back to Canada, and you go to the potlatch ceremonies of the West Coast, and the entire communities would amass all the resources. In that case, historically, it was salmon and skins and bear skins and otter pelts and all these things, and then they'd give them away. Whoever gave the most away was given the most. Or you could go across to Polynesia, to Tonga, the Kingdom of Tonga, Samoa, pre-colonial Hawaii. And the chiefs there, the big men of the community, were, if you didn't give your stuff away, you were ostracized from society. So sharing was obligatory, and the gift economy still functions in places in like Tonga. They use capitalism to support it, but it's an alternative system where one who does not share is not recognized as a human. And so if you don't share, if you don't give, if your neighbors are hungry, you feed them. If they lack clothing, you give them clothes. And it's not seen as a charity because it's a gift, and gifts carry obligations. So if what they give, you get back in return. And if that person can't repay the gift, their relatives and friends and community repays the gift. And so it becomes a circulation of resources that's completely outside of the sense of capitalism, because it's not about accumulation, it's about community.
Oh,
And there's examples all over the world like that.
yeah.
So
And Jan, then if that is the case, like we can hear there are plenty of examples that it's not profit-seeking person, individual. Could you maybe enlighten us on where that diversion happened? Why have we kind of a global society system that is driven by this individualism, while there are examples like that?
So that's quite interesting in thinking about how we think about the idea of progression, even. I mean, I want to unpack the difficulties in your question. I'm not sure that I recognize such a linear expression, that we move from one thing to another, that things aren't jolts and difficulties and challenges to be worked through that have intended and unintended consequences. Listening to you, Emike, I'm just sort of thinking about maybe Zuboff and surveillance capitalism, that I think very much kind of characterizes what we think about as capitalism in our contemporary time. But linked with what Michael was saying, I think whilst that gifting economy sits outside perhaps of what we would traditionally think of as a capitalist accumulation, there's also morality built in there, and this onus on needing to or owing people and having certain power. And that's my issue really, is that power dynamics are not specific to capitalism. They're not specific to, but they reenact themselves, and they find themselves and express themselves in the situations in the contemporary context. So I'm not sure that I particularly agree with the kind of linear structure of it. I'm not sure how optimistic I feel. I'm probably the most pessimistic person here. I'm not sure how optimistic I feel about being able to overcome this system, because to see it as a system is to see it as outside and inside, and I think that dichotomy is problematic, because I rather feel like it's more integrated than that. So I'm really interested later on in our discussion, sneak preview, to talk about reflexivity and the power that that has. And I'm happy. I'm happy in the situation of reflexivity and power, more so than I think I am in terms of thinking about linear progression. I guess I can't sit here. We can't have it. In fact, actually, I'm quite impressed we've got this far into the discussion, haven't mentioned Marx. But clearly, you know, Marx and Engels talked about capitalism, about capitalist accumulation, about it being this system. But again, I would come back to that idea that that can be rather unhelpful, that we carry forward those ideas. You said before that capitalism is absolutely rooted alongside colonialism. So those sense of power and inequality is built in. But is it built into the system, or is it reflective? You know, those are questions I guess I have about what capitalism is.
Yeah, and I guess that's something we will aim to unpack a bit. And in order to unpack that, that's why we kind of addressed whether capitalism is this natural process or whether it has been a man-made process.
Yeah.
And then we see this contradiction between examples of previous hunter-gatherer communities, for example, and the individualist society that we live in today. If I may ask to start moving into like the more interdisciplinary aspect of it, Emike, what do you feel like you can, or economics misses in describing capitalism, or if that from the other disciplines?
That's a very good question. Well, as you might know, there are different schools of economic thinking, and each school kind of like sheds new light on something that, you know, we didn't used to have. So I think it will be easier for me to answer a different question to the one that you're asking, which is, how has economic thinking appropriated today thinking from other disciplines in order to shape how we think about the system of capitalism? It's an easier one because we have made some progress. And the first step is in relaxing a lot of our classical assumptions. So one of the primary, and I mean, this will sort of speak to my training, but one of the primary assumptions of classical economics is that economic agents are selfish, and they're basically just self-serving. And we have this amazing quote, I can't remember by who, and I feel like it's to make economists sort of curl their toes, the fact I can't remember. But they say something like, it's not of the benevolence of the baker that you get your bread. There's something like, you know, the baker, there's something self-serving, there's a self-serving motivation that causes the baker to make your bread and causes the tailor to make your clothes. But actually, we've moved to a point in our economic thinking where we actually say, well, no, maybe the economic agent that you're thinking about isn't just self-serving. There are other things about the agent that we need to think about. So for instance, economic agents can be altruist, which means that they could do things that are not apparently self-serving. They care about what other people are thinking. So I could write you a utility function where the economic agent actually cares significantly about somebody else or what's happening to them. Or I could tell you about an economic agent that is given to certain behavioral biases over and beyond what their incentives are. So for instance, if I present a default option, and you know, this is often where I'll try to run a small experiment, I could show you that a good number of people in the room will follow the default option, as opposed to actually take a decision that, if you want, would be self-serving. So there are different things, like people don't like to expend effort, or, you know, people are given to certain biases. And I feel like in thinking about capitalism, we need to think about these factors because they help us color the idea that, as opposed to capitalism being, you know, being born from people actively making decisions, there's certain things about the system, or if you want, the environment, that are kind of automatic, or people just agents just respond to them, or something about the environment programs agents to respond in a certain way. I don't know if that makes any sense. So it's not so much agents driving themselves to act out, self-serving, but something about the environment. The incentives in the environment are set up so that agents, whether or not they consider their motivations to be self-serving, just end up acting in a way that the system is designed to make them act.
So it's kind of that, I guess, question of whether altruism truly exists, kind of whether you can act for self-service, but benefit the community at the same time. If I'm understanding that.
That's a separate question. I think to summarize my point will be economic thinking has moved away from agents are deliberately acting in a way that gives us the outcome that we have. And we've moved towards sometimes the environment that we have kind of causes the agents to act in certain ways that perpetuate the system, if that makes any sense.
Michael, any thoughts?
I suppose that just Marxist base superstructure. The economic base determines our actions, and we respond within that system. You're talking about that system that we're meshed within. So we're making a decision that feels like an independent, automatic, but we're actually reacting to a system that we're immersed within. And so we could go back to another example is once that capitalist penetration happens, people that used to formally act in a communitarian way, that might get broken. And then they start acting entirely selfishly or for maximizing personal gain. And you can see that when land is forcefully privatized amongst different communities where private property didn't exist. They all of a sudden the land is parceled up and divvied up. They act and respond in certain ways as if private property now matters, because it does. It has to matter, because if you don't have the title deed, you don't have the means of production, you don't control the means of production. So you react, which would, from an economics perspective, might appear as a selfish way, but you're actually just working within that system, because not everybody's out there to challenge the system, and so that kind of makes sense, I suppose. But it's, for me, it just goes right back to Marx, the base and the superstructure, and that determines your superstructure. Yeah.
How has, for example, specialization, that you pick a certain niche and just work on that, whether it's economics and psychology, how does this kind of split in disciplines, which made it hard to communicate between, like, what's it called, made that happen even more?
It's still, even though everybody talks about interdisciplinarity and all of these things, it still happens that I was applying for a research grant for an anthropological organization, and I couched it in a lot of economic arguments trying to bring in political economy, and it was ultimately rejected. And the reviewers said there's not enough anthropological theory in it. So they were saying they were literally using a financial incentive of a research grant to push me back into the anthropology, which was quite ironic considering the topic I was doing. That they wanted me more anthropological, less economic. And I thought, but I'm trying to bring the two together, and they couldn't. I thought they couldn't see that, and they wanted more of the anthropology. So we still pull into our different disciplines, and sometimes it's because of the way funding grants cycles. That's there'll be a call for economics research, there'll be a call for anthropological or sociological, and sometimes there's more opportunities to stitch those together, but it's more difficult to do so, to form a coherent project that emerges from that. And then the competitive nature of universities, which is also responding within the neoliberal environment to capitalism, we have to get students. This is why we actually formed the Global Affairs program, because we used to be international relations program and a politics program, and we would have an open day. We'd have 20 students in the room, and we'd be trying to sell them international relations or politics, which meant if we were both successful, both programs were successful, we'd have 10 students each. And that was below the threshold for the university, and they would have canceled both our programs. So we said, let's stitch them together, get all 20 students into the same room, into the same program. So we're responding to capitalism in that sense as well, because of the financial nature of the university. But we get an open day, and I'll have a student who's at the open day, and they're saying, I'm not really sure what I want to do. I was thinking maybe sociology, maybe economics, maybe maybe international relations. And I'll say, come to Global Affairs, come chat to me. And I'll try to steal that student to try to keep our student numbers up. So there's a perverse encapsulation of that.
Be selfish, right?
Yeah, in that sense, to pay our own bills and keep our jobs and all of that. So there's that happening as well.
If I can
So
say, I
yeah,
think this ties nicely onto the production of knowledge, because
Yeah.
like the disciplines are different types of knowledge, right? But maybe you can say something about like production of knowledge and how that.
Yeah, right.
works.
But I think I start off by saying that my PhD looks at gambling related harm, and at some point, I'll produce a thesis which will talk about what I've learned about that. Although the starting point for my research was kind of lived experience. So I kind of find it quite interesting that I've gone from this lived experience of this phenomena, this social phenomena, segued somehow into an academic theory and trying to understand it in that way. And I kind of wonder how much further forward I would be at the end of it all. I talked to you about the guy who talked to me about the shelves. For me, his intimate knowledge, his embodied knowledge of capitalism and all its strength and power, I think is something that I'll never achieve through the written form of a thesis. And I think that's to do with the nature of knowledge. I think it's to do with the power that's connected and tied up with knowledge as well, which structures institutions such as the university, our school education systems, etc., etc. It's a broad topic. But it's interesting because I think Zuboff talks about the idea that industrial capital exploited nature and that surveillance capitalism exploits human nature. And how many of you, just out of interest, how many of you have been on your phones at any point today? Just give us a show of hands. Oh yeah, good, okay. Right. So
I used it to tell the time. That was it.
well done, gold star. Okay, so I think what's quite interesting is that they did this research looking at how companies use this. This is really interesting, linking with what you were talking about before, Emike, is this idea that real-time data that is used and sold about us, the data that's collected through our interaction with our devices. In the US, on average, apparently it's something in the region of about 700 times a day per US citizen. This information is being sold to people who want to use it then to sell you something, okay, to target you, etc. And supposedly it's half that in Europe. And they talk about the reason why it's half that in Europe is because there's greater regulation. So regulation certainly has a place, doesn't it? But to what extent are we tinkering with a system that really is problematic beyond all recognition and needs a complete regeneration, a complete rethink rather than a tinkering with? There's things we know, and then there's the whole other stuff that we don't. And it's the knowledge beyond, I guess, the knowledge that we have that is so fascinating and that's driving us. This idea of kind of blindness by design, I find quite an interesting concept with regards to our knowledge. What knowledge do we have of ourselves? And what is the knowledge that's held about us that defines who we are? And how do we live in the spaces in between that? And what spaces are there available to live in between those places? Those are all things that keep me awake at night. Yeah.
Can I ask, is there any economic way that we may go about answering these questions? I know that's a tough one to direct, but
Okay, so I did have some thoughts about the original question, which is the dichotomy between specialization and sort of collaboration. So if you're happy for me to kind of talk on that before, in a sense, I would say I'm arguably more optimistic about the dichotomy between specialization and sort of collaborative thinking, because I kind of feel like there's certain questions that specialization allows you to get to the edge of. So for instance, if I pick a very basic one in economic thinking, it's like, what is preference? Like, so when we say, oh, people can choose based on their preferences, an economist can sit down with this idea of preference and start to ask questions like, is it intrinsic? Is your preference ascribed to you from outside? So You could go into a market, and the fact that you picked an item and you paid for it is like revealed preference to us, right? But the other question is like, where does your preference come from? Is it from what you see other people doing? Is it from social media? Or has the choice engineer kind of arranged the products so that you pick what you're picking, right? So I feel like questions like this are the sort of things that you can get to the heart of when you've spent a ridiculous amount of time on a subject matter, thinking about it in a specific type of framework. But I do think that it's really important that once you get to the edge of your understanding in this way, that we come together in a forum like this, and then we raise topics and start talking about them. That allows us to get a sense of, sometimes we find that we're talking about the same thing, but we're calling it a different name. But sometimes we find that our understanding of a thing is like, a sociologist or a psychologist, for instance, can pick a topic of choice and approach it in a way that as an economist, I would never have picked it up, if that makes any sense. And I kind of find that like being in regulation, this is what we see more of. So it's a strength that, and I do think that academia, where like, it's all about like knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and you get into the edge of like understanding a concept, and regulation do have a partnership that needs to develop a little bit more, because in regulation, the problems are coming at you quickly, they're overwhelming, and you don't really have the time. In academia, you pick your problem, you define the question, and you give it as much time as you think you can, giving funding to like get to the end, get to the edge, and get to the end of a question. So I think, I think there's a beauty in the ability to specialize, but also come together to talk about things. And in terms of how can an economist, or how will economic thinking help us, I would say like economic thinking will help us to think about the problem as an economist would. Like, there's certain problems, for instance. So I love the fact that you brought up big data, because when I was thinking about capitalism and consumerism, big data was something that came up. But we can't talk about capitalism today without thinking about big data. Like you pick your phone, and I don't know if you know, but even the design, like I'll use the word choice architecture. Like when you if you download a new app, there are all this barrage of questions that come at you, and the accept button is blue and it's highlighted and it's attractive, and your finger just goes accept. But really, you don't know. In today's economy, or in today's global economy, information is so powerful. Like the firms with the information, like control kind of where the money goes. If I know who you are, and I know I have information about you, like your age, your gender, your ethnicity, I don't know, where you live, I could tailor sort of the advertisement I send to you in a way that will make, sure that you're always like purchasing. So I think big data is really essential in how firms push their products, but also how consumers kind of pick the products as well. And I don't know that economics specifically can give you like a framework to answer a lot of these questions, because some of them are also legal. For instance, what does a legal framework say? What can the firms legally do? And what consumer power, what powers do consumers legally have? Does that make any sense?
That just means that next time we have a panel, we'll invite a lawyer.
I think that just to add to that is, whenever I hear the word big data, my mind automatically goes to Cambridge Analytica. And that was the company that took all of that user data and they used it to manipulate all sorts of people in politics. And they were actively found to be sowing racial discord in South Africa to try and support one political party over another. And they were found out with this. And there's examples of big data being used, and it is being used to manipulate our elections, the algorithms on everything X now instead of Twitter, and Facebook and all of that. We are being manipulated, and our data is being harvested. Anything that is free like Google. Like I remember when Google first came out, I was like, and YouTube came out. How can they just give us this stuff? Like was it like a largesse by some organization? How is it Google's growing as a corporation when the only product they seem to have is free? Because of course it wasn't. Google search engine is not the product. We are the product, and our data, our user preferences. And I find it really funny because whenever I research for a particular topic, because I move outside of my discipline all the time in my teaching, all of a sudden my algorithms shift, and I'll get things that were because I'm messing with the algorithm by not by accident, by looking at a topic that's not my normal course, and so my whole user feed gets changed on all of these things, and it's really scary, actually.
Yeah, it's the commodification of humanity,
I love that.
which is really, that's not mine.
But not new, of course, not new slavery.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, that certainly has been my experience in my PhD research, this idea of commodification of human experience. And you talked about us becoming data points, Michael, you know, that we are these rich data points that people want, that that we've been reduced to, that we are in very many ways automated in our lifestyles, in our choices. I have real problems with the idea of choice. Yeah, I think that the system is so broad and so wide. We talked about, you know, about disciplines, and I recognize fully what you're saying. I think it's really important that disciplines are able to narrow down and find information, but then share with one another. But there are really intrinsic powers linked with those separate disciplines, those silos of information, the knowledge that they're producing, how that knowledge is used, who's in charge of that data, who's in charge of that knowledge, in what way they perpetuate it, and for what end. I think this idea of blindness by design is really important. They're producing now cars which are constantly surveying us, constantly surveying all aspects of our lives, about where we go, about what we do, about who we're with. We do have to question, you know, what is the validity of that level of knowledge? We're becoming a knowledge, you know, community. What are our thoughts about it? Ironically, I find that universities are about knowledge, but they're not necessarily all about discussing knowledge and unpacking knowledge and thinking about what knowledge is, thinking about embodied knowledge rather than necessarily big knowledge. Yeah, and its production, I think, still is petered out into these different spaces. And I also think there's just like a bit of an ignorance about and an arrogance actually to think that knowledge is only produced in these spaces, in these academic spaces, that knowledge isn't amongst people and communities. And how can we make those communal links? How can we prevent knowledge being used to individualize us rather than build our communities? Because once power is infiltrated in that way, it becomes you don't have a great deal of power just as an individual. We need it as communities. But where are those genuine community spaces? Because I'm not that convinced that Facebook groups are community spaces in the way that I would like to envisage or think about community, or think about how community has true power for greater human autonomy, for greater human expression, for liberty, I suppose, if we want to go really out there.
I've heard people like say that this system, in a sense, has pushed us from deprioritizing our number one thing, which is actually community and family and things like that, into what should be a number two, which is like consuming things and material things. So that is perhaps a big red flag of capitalism, if I can say. But what can I ask? What have been, since we have bashed capitalism and stuff like that now? What are some positive sides? Like I think we are all here today in a sense somehow thank you to capitalism as well. The internationalities, all of that. What are those positive sides?
I could go first. I'll say innovation.
Innovation.
Innovation is one thing, and innovation that is driven by healthy competition. Because competition can be healthy. Otherwise, the Competition and Markets Authority would not exist. We wouldn't really have a thing to do. But yeah, like, and also, that I think there's room for that individual expression and creativity. And so I'll say that would be like the primary, at the very core, I would say that's the primary thing that capitalism to some degree allows, human creativity to flourish, and you see it through innovation. That's the primary thing for me. I don't really have any other positives that I like to push until I've heard what Jen and Michael have to say.
Innovation is only pushed through capitalism if it earns a profit, and that's the big problem. It's never, something's never created just because it's beautiful or someone might find it useful, and it's only if it can be sold on at a greater and greater profit. So I suppose that's a difficulty I have with the innovation and creativity of capitalism, because I think it actually destroys more than it creates. And there's a lot of myth making that goes into that. And you think about the innovation, let's think pharmaceuticals, amazing drug gets found, discovered, and a private company develops that. And there's a competition between other companies to develop that. And they're first, they patent it, they make millions or even billions off that drug. And people say, well, that's beneficial to humanity. But the truth is, those medical professionals who did that research were probably trained in a state school at some point. So that whole society supported those people to get a job, and then their knowledge is then privatized. But in fact, it was society that raised them up to be able to be a scientist, to discover those things. So we're privatizing something social at that point anyways, because they say, well, but that drug, and then we're going to hang on to that. But if society was involved in the training of that person at some point, a public university, and so on, then should that drug company have exclusive rights to that knowledge and that? And I would say no, but capitalists would completely disagree with me on that. And so we constantly see that push where a small company is out there doing something, selling something, and a big company comes along and says, oh, I like what you've got, we'll buy it up and shut it down. They don't expand on it. And we see that with computers. Two companies, basically, there's two types of computers, two operating systems essentially in the world, till Linux came along in the open source versions. Also, other variations of computing were silenced and shut down, and those companies became these massive corporations that bought up all of that intellectual creativity of data scientists, computer scientists that were making new things. So we've got a very narrow band of innovation actually within computing, even though it's done amazing things. But what have we lost through that? And that's the question I would always wonder, is those big corporations, they just absorb everything they buy up. Automobile companies did the same thing. There used to be more companies, they get bought up. And I was reading a story about a Porsche and a VW having the identical engine and chassis and frame, just different dressing on top. And they've all just bought up, and it becomes fewer and fewer companies and fewer, and I would say fewer and fewer creativity, because they just buy it up and silence it. Yeah.
The first thing is, I completely acknowledge what you are saying. I don't disagree with it at all. I just want to color the argument at the margin. So I do think that in our human lived experience, there's space for there's space for like collaborative expression, like society, community, what we can do together. There's also space for the individual expression, what I can do, and celebrating that as well. Of course, one could argue whether or not capitalism is the right vehicle to celebrate the individual expression. That's an argument. That's fine. I'll take it. But then even looking at sort of something from behavioral economics that we call like a simple public goods game. So basically, I take four people and I have them play a game. Now, what we find when we play this game with lots of people over lots of periods is that you end up finding the free rider. So there comes a lot of free riding. So this is a hypothetical question. I don't know, but I wonder if in alternative systems, and maybe you're the person to answer this, Michael, we have a lot more free riding because the system looks after you. Does that make a lot of sense?
Before we move, could you briefly define free riding?
So free riding is a situation where like you kind of have economic agents that take advantage of the benevolence of the group and don't actually apply themselves to sort of contributing to the public good. Because, you know, why? I think, and I don't know if you have this in anthropology, it's like the tragedy of commons. Yeah, so like, you know, so I wonder if those types of problems kind of exist more in alternative systems as opposed to a system like and of course we know that capitalism has its ills. I'm just sort of wondering, like in an ideal setting, do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. The tragedy of the commons. It's kind of an assumption that happens everywhere and in every case. And I think Swedish forestry says otherwise. You've got communally held forests and nobody exploits them. And the doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. They manage the forest, they share the resources, they cut the wood, they replant the trees, and these communal forests have existed for hundreds of years. And it's like, where's their tragedy of the commons? If that's an assumption, again, the economics says if this happened here, and they use that from the British example, the tragedy of the commons emerged, that the commons would get just overgrazed, and there'd be all those free riders who'd say, well, I might as well have an extra few set of cattle on this to maximize my profits. They completely forget that at the time period that was being written was the Enclosure Acts, where there was a great political power move to drive the peasantry off the land as society shifted and changed. And so you were in a situation of mass exploitation. And the British system, the feudal system, was pretty brutal, where peasants were paying rents and tithes to landlords, who they themselves added no value to the system whatsoever, other than to take the rents and collect the mass wealth. So in that highly exploitative system, there's no surprise that when there was a commons, people within that exploitative system exploited it for their own gain to the detriment of everyone else. It was a pretty brutal world during that emerging from the Dark Ages. So I don't think that's a surprise. And so again, one of my problems with economics, which is why when I studied economics at undergrad, I then shifted away from it, was there's all those kind of assumptions being made, and there was a lack of historical understanding, and that deeper contextualization is needed, and that's where, you know, what adds to it a lot more. So,
yeah, I think, you know, if we think about capitalism, we can think not just from economics or sociology or anthropology, but we can think about it from philosophy, from English literature, from so many different angles, I think, which gives us a broader picture or a closer picture to perhaps dealing with. I think Marx saw capitalism as truly exploitative. I can't say that I feel very much different from that, but okay, Weber said a bit differently. He argued that actually capitalism brought about a sense of innovation and healthy competition. And he said that, you know, that was a positive. I would say that to, you know, win us with honest trifles is to betray us in deepest consequence. But to borrow Shakespeare's term, I think there's a sense that this idea that capitalism can be good and it can give us innovation is problematic in and of itself. I think fundamentally the system's not set up that way. So I just don't see it being able to produce that good that we've been talking about. But I know I sit very much on an end of a scale there. Yeah, the most hope I can give from a sociology perspective is that, yeah, okay, Weber said bureaucracy and rationalization are deeply problematic. We see that from prior to the mid-19th century, talking about history, about this sense of kind of religion dominating and bureaucracy dominating, and they weren't good times either. Let's be honest. We're not looking at rose-tinted glasses here and saying, you know, before capitalism it was all great and it was all fine, or it will be post-capitalism. I can't say that I see it in that way. I think it's more embedded than that. So yeah. You know, mentioned history there. I think that's really important factors to factor in history, and perhaps it's an argument that economics doesn't so much.
Not as much, but I wanted to speak to something else that Michael mentioned earlier, which was I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned a lot of the big corps and their ability to kind of buy out or dominate certain product spaces. I don't know if we're going to get there eventually, but I kind of feel like that's an aspect that regulation tackles quite significantly. So looking at like market power and trying to ensure that there are no like barriers to entry or exit, or like no big corp with market power is kind of exploiting their market power to the detriment of everyone. Of course, like this represents like a market failure. And that's why regulation kind of comes in to try to solve a thing like this. It's just something that I wanted to flag. We could talk about it later.
How about I ask one last question and then we take a 5-minute break.
Sure.
Bring some toilets. So if I may almost challenge Michael as well and ask, because we will move on to reflexivity, but this assumption that you mentioned, like we're only innovating or creating for the sake of profit, kind of holds an assumption that we are all selfish, which is the exact same assumption that we critique economics for. Is this kind of a reinforcing loop that we're almost that capitalism puts these glasses on for us almost? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I suppose I'm talking a contradiction in a certain way. Is I accuse these people of being self-interested, profit-making, and then I argue that not everyone's selfish profit-making, and that I say, but they clearly are. And you know, so perhaps there's a contradiction in that. I guess the big thing for me is that for capitalism, there's a lot of myth-making in it. And to borrow from David Graeber, the kind of anarchist anthropologist who passed away quite recently, well before his time, but he's got a wonderful quote here. He says, and he proved capitalism doesn't reward hard work. It rewards being born rich, knowing the right people, or exploiting others. Meanwhile, nurses, teachers, and garbage collectors, the people who actually keep society running, are paid pennies while hedge fund managers gamble with our lives. And so there are those very contradictions built into the very system. Those that are in positions of wealth have all of the self-interest in the world to continue to perpetuate that wealth. And so they do so, and they swallow up all of those other people, and they put that downward pressure on wages and salaries for the normal people out there that are not given an opportunity or a chance to be an innovator. And really, really horrible things. And some of the other things, it's that, you know, again, David Harvey as well contradicts the capitalism, David Graeber as well. They talk about how it's a scam, capitalism. First of all, it's Wall Street crashes the economy and then gets bailed out. Tells all of us austerity is needed. That's what we're going through right now. Tighten your belts, winter fuel allowances, cost of living crisis, all of this, we get told we're going to have to live through austerity to balance the budget by a Labour government that's drifted far from its roots. Thames Water gets bailed out recently. Billions of pounds to keep the water flowing instead of being taken from them because they can't manage it. So they privatize the profits and socialize the losses is what these companies are doing. And it's immensely frustrating to watch that. And capitalism thrives in these crises. Austerity, we crash the economy and it hits reset. They buy up all the resources on the cheap, fire all the workers. Yeah, and then they move to the gig economy. where we're told that these people are free contractors, independent contractors. They're not. They're highly exploited, where they slip between the regulations and they are unable to even get minimum wage because they're now self-employed. And we have systems where food is destroyed to keep prices artificially high. And there's people going hungry in drought-stricken areas of the Horn of Africa. And we've got another famine looming in those places because their crops are failing because of global warming, once again caused by capitalism and industrial capital in particular there. And then just to compound that even a little bit more, now they're talking about we should dim the sun. There's experiments being 55 billion being earmarked, 55 million, whatever this science, see if we can dim the sun. All that is saying is, can we just keep going business as usual? Let's just keep polluting. If we can dim the sun, solve global warming, and business as usual, keep consuming like madmen. And they say there's no alternative, but the alternative is survival. So, but anyways, I will stop there.
Yeah.
A lot to try and respond to.
Closing before we take a break.
Only one that I think we'd come back to, because I think a lot of what we've talked about so far has been about polarizing agency and structure. I think that's really problematic. And I think someone like Bourdieu brings those two things together and says actually that they're inextricably linked, that you can't untie them. And I think that's a more helpful way of looking, because otherwise I think it does become a blame game, which, or well, it's up to agents to do better, or yes, but we're being pushed by the big corporations. How can the little man do anything? And I think that you're just going round and round in circles. We need to change the way we discuss it. I think that.
Well, to be fair, I didn't plan to come here. I didn't plan to come here to speak as the evil economist and put myself in that position. I do want to say that over and beyond everything, economic thinking is also quite aware of the failure of, if you want, the system. And so we have an entire sort of I'll say like stream thinking about and trying to address the market failures. Now, whether or not, thinking about and addressing the market failures is enough is a different conversation. But it's really, I think, adopting at this point an alternative system it kind of feels a little bit like wishful thinking. That's my sense. So I think one has to acknowledge the role that regulation plays in trying to, or maybe not plays, but the role that regulation can play in trying to address the failures of the market. So, picking up the things at the margins that capitalism cannot and does not have structures to look after.
And that's very nice. First of all, like when we made the economic society, that was the fear as well. The name, just the other question I had, someone asked me, why would you join the economic society? And because it is a dirty name, right? But again, economics, like this is the big ball that we are all rolling in, and that's why perhaps whether it's wishful thinking or not, we might have to address this through economics, which is why we're having this interdisciplinary discussion. So shall we say 5 minutes to come back just before past, and we'll continue on reflexive.